Hello, everybody. Ian Barkin back with you again for yet another OneTAKE Live coming at you over LinkedIn and Twitter. Thanks so much for joining us. If you're new to the show, this is a chance for me to speak to experts about their one take on the future of work, life, and culture. So that is what we do here. And before I get started, I want to say a few things. One, if you are a fan of the show, I'm thrilled to say that we've got another star in the network, if you will, another Sykes TV show live now. As of yesterday, we've got a new show called Career Talks with Orlando Haynes. You should absolutely check that out. Orlando Haynes talks about recruiting and jobs and skill development and careers, etc. So check it out, Orlando Haynes. If you follow him on LinkedIn, you can find his show. It is a good one, and he's live every Wednesday at noon. And also, I hope everyone's healthy and well in these trying times. If you do find yourself looking for work, Sykes is always hiring. You can find opportunities at jobs.sykes.com. Again, jobs.sykes.com. Great work at home opportunities to protect safety and livelihood and to work with the world's leading brands. So, okay, let's get on with the show. If you are joining us, please absolutely share your name, your location, and we will see it pop up in the comment feeds. And if you have a question, also please post that. We're using a new tool where we can actually show your face off, show your question off, and answer it. So please do that. So my next guest, I got to get on with this quickly because there's so much we could cover. My next guest is a lot of the different things that I said the show covers: future of work, life, culture. And he's actually written an awesome new book about that. So without further ado, I want to welcome to OneTAKE Live, Trond Undheim. Trond, welcome to the show.
Ian, excited to be here. This is a cool concept. I like the one take idea.
Thank you. Yeah, it was one take, one person. Also, we try not to screw it up, so we just do the whole thing in one take. So here you go. Okay, so Trond, you and I have known each other for a few years. For the viewers, our background is Trond was at MIT Sloan and was doing some really interesting things. I had the luck and the good fortune of getting to meet Trond. Trond, you have a PhD in an incredibly relevant set of topics, but a future of work and AI and cognition. You then went on and did work at MIT Sloan, including heading up the Startup Exchange. You're a futurist. You're a speaker. You're an entrepreneur. You started a company called Yegii. We can touch on quickly if you want. So. What am I missing? Give me your background and what's driven you to do so many interesting things in your career.
Well, thank you. First of all, I think you covered almost everything. You missed the EU. It's easy to miss in America, but there's a whole platform called the EU, and I was lucky enough to be seconded from Norway, which is a country not even part of the EU, but I was one of the very few that got to work there for 4 years in the e-government setting there, setting policies for technology all across Europe. It was actually fascinating. It brought me into some of the things that I enjoy doing, which is building programs from scratch. So one of the things I built there was a setup called ePractice EU, sharing good and bad practice on all kinds of investments in e-government, which has not become less relevant in this pandemic, all around Europe. You know, literally billions of dollars, euros invested in technology, some of them completely wasted, others making things more transparent, more efficient in so many interesting ways. And I set up a program to share all of that. We started out with some 50 users, I think, and we ended up with 100,000. So that's one thing you missed. But I've been blessed to do a lot of different things. I think I like to dip into an organization, put myself immediately at the outskirts of that organization, and then look in and look out. And I think this looking out is, at least for me, I'm a curious guy. It's such a fundamental part of any organization. It's the most difficult thing to be at the borderlines of the inside and the outside of an organization. But I think in terms of giving you a little cue as to what I think is the future of work, that kind of role is going to become much more prevalent. So the question is, of course, what kind of skill does it take? What kind of experiences do you need in order to do that well? And how do you survive doing it?
Interesting. And yes, the EU is amazingly relevant, incredibly pertinent, especially now, as you say. Talk a little bit about Yegii just briefly. Just it was part of the reason that you and I met, and would love to hear just some of the inspiration behind that, and then we'll move on because I want to talk about some of the books that you've written. A most recent book that you've written, which is extraordinary, and I'll show it off when we get there, and we'll put links in the show notes for it, and then want to get on to future of work and your take on multiple elements of what's really transpiring as we speak. So
Yegii is a little bit of a thunder of an ambition, and I mean, I almost broke my back over it. So the whole idea is, right now, for the last few decades, we've been depending on a very inferior way to access and sift through the noise of knowledge. So the ambition was nothing less than trying to find a different way to do that, whether through technology or through experts or both. The challenge with it, of course, is when you're dealing with an incumbent that is a Google, or you're actually dealing with just very traditional ways of sifting through knowledge in corporations. And also as individuals, we are confronted with the whole wide web, and we have so much information. The incentives were not, I think, aligned for what I think still is the big thing to come, which is we need better tools, maybe not one, in order to sift through all of the, not just the information out there, but to prioritize and to collaborate. So it ties into this whole idea of not just the future of work, but actually how are we going to make sense of the reality around us, share that with others efficiently, and obviously in some way value the experience and the information that comes in without creating what I see as a very big problem, these kind of gated, these walled gardens where information and knowledge is more and more put into these very wealthy networks where you have to pay to play, but also it's very unclear whether the information in there really can sustain itself at a very high density and quality when you don't have a lot of inputs into that information. So it's what I have discovered in trying to build that solution. First of all, knowledge is not just about listing kind of the top 5 newsletters you should subscribe to. It is so much more than that. The surprise has been interviewing thousands of experts and realizing they actually sometimes had to scratch their heads. Partly because I didn't just ask them in your field, even in their own fields, they didn't really know what they were doing on an everyday basis. They clearly were informed. They just didn't know how they got there. But then I started asking them, wider, how do you probe and learn new things? Thinking about this idea that a polymath really is the only type of role where you can make true impact, right? Every founder is actually a polymath, not just Elon Musk. So now how do you design systemically for being and becoming a polymath? So that's actually what I'm engaged with now. And long story short, I've taken to a lot of different avenues in order to make that happen. One thing was to build that expert network through Yegii and to build a digital solution to try to just scratch the surface of what that is about. I think I've now realized that I was starting to peel an onion that was enormous. And it's not just a matter of having money to do so, the imagination. So I took on a challenge that is definitely larger than me. And I have to say, 5-6 years later, I'm still scratching at that onion. And I think I would love to find someone on your show or otherwise who can actually in a significant way help me with this. And I'm not talking about algorithms. This is a challenge far beyond the current very limited, AIs that we have available. Right.
Well, it was an interesting discussion we had years ago. It still is the idea of finding experts, mining that expertise, understanding what informs decisions in general. So and thank you for that. So let's segue. Speaking of polymaths and hugely prolific ones. So you've written. I'm going to talk about your books. So you've written 3 books so far. I moved recently. I used to have your first book, Leadership from Below. I cannot find it to save myself because I wanted to hold it up. But so Leadership Below was your first book. You then wrote Disruption Games this year, and then wrote Pandemic Aftermath also this year. And this book is the one that I want to really double click on, unpack. But this thing's extraordinary. And so we will put a link in the show notes for it. It blows my mind that you could write something this size and this sort of intellectual heft in the time that you did. So first and foremost, I guess, just out of personal pure fascination, how did you take on this project and get it done so quickly?
The short answer is depression can do many things to you. I was simply so quickly convinced that this was going major downhill for the world. And this was literally the first week of February when I think I realized this.
Right.
And I realized another thing. I was not a medical doctor. I was not going to go on the front lines. I also have kids and I didn't want to really expose myself. So I said, what is it in my unique skill set I can do? So I started to embrace the long-term consequences on a societal nature that I could start writing about. And very quickly I got into, well, what do we know about this? Not just in terms of the disease, etymology and all of the medical dimensions, but what have governments known about this? What are the preparedness studies? I looked at 15 different government pandemic scenarios.
Yep.
I looked at the highly limited number of people who were involved in those exercises, and I started to realize this is not only a recipe for massive disaster, but it's likely to be very, very misunderstood in the time to come. And that motivated me to do 17-hour writing stints, which I have to apologize to my kids and everybody around me, obviously had some consequences because I was not a pleasant person for about 7 weeks there. But I did write 450 pages with about 50 pages of references. And it was a kind of one of the massive gargantuan efforts that I would compare to kind of the last run up to my PhD. It was a very serious time in my life. But let's talk about some of the findings.
Yeah, well, so I mean, I guess given the option of being not a very agreeable person and not producing a book, or being a tough person to be around and producing a book, that would be the one I choose. So as you say, so what you do here is you break down in the first part of the book. It is nonfiction. You are talking about what actually happened. You're laying out the scenario as it played out, talking about just the history of it up to the point at which you went to press. So China and the Italy situation unfolding throughout Europe, the way that different Nordic countries handled it, what happened in the U.S. I love the highlight of not only the different agencies, governmental agencies and governments and parliaments around the world, and the studies and scenario-based planning they'd been doing for decades as far as any sort of major pandemic. You also, it was interesting, you highlighted books that have been written about fictitious and non-fictitious books about such situations that have been written all the way back to the 1700s. So that in and of itself was interesting. It was it's very real, very present. Obviously, we're still living in it. But then you pivot to the futurist in you and the polymath in you, and the prolific polymath to be able to put this all together. But you take people through 5 different scenarios, really to explore what might happen over the next decade. And you take us to 2030 in 5 different ways. Take us through what those 5 scenarios are, and then I want to sort of dig down further on a few of them.
Sure, we'll dig in. And let me say first, smart futurists these days don't actually talk about the future as a forecast, because I think what we've all realized, and this is why I was very reluctant to take on this label futurist, but you got to live off of something. The point is, you have scenarios and they don't all pan out the way you think they're going to pan out. And that's the point. So in futurist analysis these days, scenario methods, is kind of the winning game. What you then do is you extrapolate based on a framework you have of reality. You look at different things, and we will look in detail at this. I was lucky enough that I have been spending a lot of time developing a fairly granular framework for disruption based on very familiar factors. So tech is, a very important factor.
Yep.
Business models and how tech kind of gets operationalized is important. And then the backlash of these other 2 forces, which is number 1, regulatory and policy factors, which actually can make or break new markets and can certainly shape markets. We've seen that the attempts that are now being made in the EU, and obviously with the new tech hearings for potential antitrust in the US, which, by the way, will, of course, depend a lot on the election. And then the fourth factor being social dynamics, which we all, I think, have learned can interfere in any debate and, and reshape things. And then the fifth factor being the environment, which obviously is the biggest lurking factor here for us right now, notably with climate change. And number two, this, what I call an environmental factor of essentially getting too close to animals, which is the pandemic.
Yeah, which led us to eating things that had a zootropic effect, and as you even say, a lot of us have become armchair epidemiologists, myself included.
And by the way, there's nothing wrong with that. I react very strongly to those who say, let's leave this to the medics and the economists. In fact, that was one of my reasons for writing the book, because if we cannot in a free society speculate about this, and by the way, my book was briefly censored by one of the biggest distribution platforms because I was not an epidemiologist. Which I find extremely fascinating. We are entering a day and age, my friend, where you're going to have to rethink everything you knew about government, about big corporates, and about yourself.
That's fascinating. That's a badge of honor. I did not know that.
I love it. I love it. I love the story around it. I love the fact that it's still now out there. I mean, I cried tears for a little while. Until we figured out why. The reasoning was also extremely opaque. But let's not, cry over spilled milk. It actually didn't just happen to me. It happened to a bunch of people.
Interesting. Okay. Yeah. So you've got 5 scenarios, and they really do span a sort of a spectrum of really sort of, I guess, hopeful futurist vision to some really dystopian dark visions. And the 5, just to show off that I actually read the book.
I can't believe you read the book in 24 hours. Sorry, that shows your.
It's a lot of book to. This is why I'm so darn impressed by it. It is not just its length again, but the thoroughness of the research you did in the first part, and then the really inspired sort of creative, just the forecasts and ideas that you put in these scenarios. I loved. I'm going to go back and read it even more closely and highlight the heck out of it, because I really do think it's going to drive some of the way that I approach things. So enough about me reading a book. But so you have the scenario 1, which is borderless world. Scenario, which is let's see, how do we want to do this? I'll read them and then we'll go back and I'll let you sort of quickly explain them. So you got borderless world, you've got nation state renewal, 2 worlds apart, Hobbesian chaos, dark and scary, and then the 5th, which is status quo. So start with borderless world. What are the sort of the dynamics of the borderless world scenario?
Science wins. In one word, science wins. Meaning, at some point, the citizen of the world and the biggest nation states just agree, nation state levels cannot solve these problems. Yep. And much like, after the First World War, we built the League of Nations. After the second, we built the UN. Yeah. I'm forecasting as one option that within the next decade, and this is, in my scenario, happens the last year of the decade, some form of very active global governance model takes over most of the coordinating functions that would be had by the big nation states. Yeah. And at least becomes a coordinating level that is far different than the current UN. It really has very little to do with the way that operates, and starts to say science is principle number 1. Yeah. The challenge, of course, if you want to go into the granularity of it, is that has a number of consequences in terms of how things are approached. It is not necessarily, science is not democracy, by the way. Very important distinction. It does escalate things that I know people on your show care about, which is technology progress and the future of work. Mm-hmm. But it does have some consequences for ethics, which are not, it's kind of an orthogonal topic to science.
Right. No, and I love you kick it off. I mean, Enrico in Italy as this kid who then grows up and is presenting to the science board is just, it has you hooked the moment you read it. I love the idea of, or I'm intrigued by the idea of building on the sort of the traditional judicial, legislative, executive, and then adding to it science and environmental and religious. I think it's again creative, makes you really think hard about, and obviously scenario design allows you the freedom of possibility, right? So whether
and I want to say this is a highly unusual scenario study, because the proper way to do this is to consult thousands of stakeholders, and I did read a lot of reports, but typically you consult with the live stakeholders in governments and and business. And in fact, that this is sort of a little unfair, because my criticism of all the existing frameworks is that they didn't do it right. And of course, I also didn't do it right, because my only justification being I wrote it in 7 weeks and wanted it out to try to save the world. Of course, I haven't saved the world, because not enough people have read this book. But essentially, I was also kind of nice, because if you are a government, there's like 4 pages of instructions after each chapter. You can run a scenario exercise based on this, and that's worth a couple of $100,000 in and of itself. So I think that was pretty nice.
And then I'd love to go there later on in the discussion, because it wasn't just the 7 weeks you wrote it. It was, as you said, it was your exposure to the EU and philosophies around investment and education. It was everything you did in Yegii and speaking to these polymaths that has
I mean, I think that was that was what I realized, was that I was in a pretty unique position to try to chart all these things out. And I was crazy enough, because you have to have the combination of having the insight and then the dedication and the craziness to sort of attempt it. And I knew I had each of those, so I just did it.
You had all of those. You had the right amount. You had the right amount of crazy, and you got it done. Okay, so Borderless World. The next one I probably want to spend more time on. So maybe I'll skip nation state renewal for a moment, and talk about maybe Two Worlds Apart, because there's some socio-political dynamics to that really do resonate and are very much based in truth. So to talk about the Two Worlds Apart scenario.
To be honest, that's where it right now looks like we are heading, but also that's just where we are. And it was a emotional scenario to write for me, because I realized that I am somehow uncomfortably on the one side of that two worlds apart, but the other. So let me explain what this is. So what are these two worlds? It's the clean world and the dirty world. And that sounds like the 3% movie on Netflix, but it's very different, really, because what I envision is that gated communities, and that the elite always buys themselves expensive real estate in high-flying places and protects themselves. But the point is, a virus and a pandemic of this dimension just takes that to a whole other level, because I think if the last 7 months have shown anything, it is that it is almost impossible to isolate yourself unless you truly isolate yourself. And I think what these bunkers and all of those ideas got wrong, and live in New Zealand, all of those, what they got wrong is that the elite may want to be a combination of being involved in the world with their real businesses, which they still want to run, but they still want to be contained and away. Yet the place that they are away has to be attractive enough. You can't just have a golf course. You can't just have a swimming pool. So what I'm saying is, at some point, these elite compounds are going to have to be entire social systems. And I chart all the way from billionaires of the world uniting, saying, here is this real estate company. We're giving you, we're prepared for 100 million checks in to buy into this new idea, and then they go ahead and buy islands and seg them out basically as their own jurisdictions. But the interesting thing, I think, is the other side of the coin. So I was thinking very deeply about, beyond Hollywood and Netflix, what would happen to not just the 99%, it's actually the 99.9%. And the point is, the deeper I thought about it, the more I found that even if they were, of course, discriminated in the sense that they weren't given access to this clean, perfect world, and they would be exploited in this scenario, that you would pull out the scientists, you'd pull out all the beautiful people, you'd pull out all the resources that you would need. These resort countries around the world would be so disappearingly small in order to be containable that the rest of the world would actually not be held. And I think that is the saving grace of this scenario. Now, there are a number of governance consequences of this scenario. I mean, obviously, to some extent, you know, it's not the corporates ruling, it's not the government's ruling, it's the financial elite,
Right.
which of course contains all of those in them,
Right.
moving
Yep.
out. It's the victory of the private sphere elite.
Sure.
Yeah.
It's yep. It was sort of make a bunker shopping joke, but it really it is an interesting scenario that really does play on the huge have not, or just the wealth divide.
But it's also so interesting, Ian. No one wants to live in a bunker. So I thought long and hard about how to construct this idea. But, you know, of course, nobody wants to live in a bunker. I mean, this whole idea is ridiculous. So we're going to talk about the future of work. Let's talk about the future of escapism and the future of preppers.
Yeah.
You know, whether you are a $5 a week prepper or a $5 billion a year prepper, you're going to rebuild society in order to survive that prepping identity. And I think this goes to something very serious, which is all of these government scenarios, 15 of them, they never went past the first month.
Interesting.
So this whole world lockdown that we've been experiencing right now, or lack thereof, but somewhat of a lockdown around the world, the fact that we're all feeling it, nobody had any idea. Don't let them tell you anything else. Yep. There's going to be all kinds of consequences after this in countries like the UK and others, where they did actually hide the consequences of the scenarios. Mm-hmm. But the most important point is this: none of the scenarios had any idea about what we're experiencing and what we will experience. And that's the real lesson.
Right. It's speaking of hiding scenarios, it's interesting. You relate it to the 1918 flu and how the media had hidden some of the scale at which that flu was impacting society, just because they didn't want to thwart the enthusiasms around the war effort, and as a result, lost a lot of I guess respect and trust in the media. I don't want to move past that scenario until I do point out, I think it was interesting that you had AI, you had artificial intelligence do the vetting of who the beautiful people were. So that was an interesting use of AI. Good for you.
Well, you did note, Ian, that in all of these scenarios, I try to unpack the tech consequences, and they're very different in these 5 scenarios. And
absolutely.
You know, and again, you know, I'm not saying any of these 5 will happen, but what I'm trying to tell people is to try to look at what is your ideal version of the world within these 5. What aspects would you pick? Because if we don't pick, we will end up in one of these,
right?
And you won't have any control about which one it is.
Well, in these scenario-based sort of design thinking exercises, business uses all the time, and it's without some sort of mental image of an end state, good, bad, aspirational, or dystopian. You need that just because it will then influence the investments you make, the decisions you make, and the actions you take. So let's. The scenario 2, in my mind, was a great pivot to getting us to the future of work. So in scenario 2 was a nation state renewal. A few different things about that just to set it up. So one of them, as far as your timeline, as you stated, of a lot of these scenarios that governments have a very short timeline. You're thinking a decade. Right? In a lot of what you highlight, we're in 2030 in these scenarios. In scenario 2, in 2030, I believe it was the very first football, soccer for Americans, and only Americans, so football for the rest of the world. But the very first football final is happening in, I guess it was Germany.
In Berlin, yeah.
Yeah, and it's being held in a Class 4 public hygiene certified stadium. And that's 2030, and we're all trying to get back to watching organized sports now. But besides that, you talk about a lot of different technology advancements in the nation state renewal that I think will, if they come to pass, and they're all based on truisms and foundations we have already, if they come to pass, they'll influence very heavily this future of work, just design and schema that we will find ourselves in. So talk a little bit about scenario 2.
Scenario 2 is, I think, for many people, unless they are of this idea that status quo, like nothing's going to change, we're going to go back to this new normal, which is a term I completely loathe. I think it's very wrong, and we're not going to be back to anything that's normal, and neither is it going to be particularly new. Neither is it going to be old, and it certainly won't be new normal. But anyway, this scenario sort of says the best governance structure for a large crisis and a large opportunity is the structure we already have. And the most functioning, arguably, structure we have is the nation state. It was created a couple of 100 years ago. It has gone through all kinds of different changes, but some of the nation states we have today are largely well functioning, unless they're too large, which, in which case they don't work so well.
Okay.
But the point being, isn't it quite easy to imagine that let's just start with some of the things we know being the same, i.e. democracy and the rule of law and a lot of useful things that you actually need to rebuild in a crisis. So what I do there is I just extrapolate on those principles and chart what would happen under various scenarios. You could sort of say this is a vaccine kind of works scenario for me. Yep. The point being that in some of these scenarios, the vaccines don't work out at all. In other of the scenarios, they do work out, but it takes a while. Yeah. But this scenario, I think, is interesting because it takes into account some of the things that governments that were doing really well in wave one just didn't put in there, including my own home country, Norway. So fantastic plans in stage one, did really well, but they haven't accounted for this important principle of intermittency, which I think you alluded to, which is going to really be, if you want to call it a new normal, it is intermittency, which is not normal at all, which is going back, lockdown, not lockdown, opening up, closing down, and becoming really adept at doing so, but within the principle of governance where the nation states runs the show, but of course, in very big coordination with the lower level of governance. So this is not an idea, I think, this scenario where it could only work if the nation was the only structure. But by nation, I mean, the structure of governance where the nation is the highest level of governance, but where it trickles down and you have some sort of information about what each, even down to the city and town, what they're doing, and you have an intelligent way of managing essentially a situation where you're trying to just reduce uncertainty, but keep the markets somewhat open and keep the culture somewhat functioning, but with some very real consequences because of the mega spreader events, which are taking a very big part of my book, really. I think, the reality of mega spreader and super spreader events, and I actually have some other terms for them too when they are in larger cities. I think there are some very real discussions to be had about whether religion, sports, and culture can go on in the way it has grown in the last 100 years.
Right.
And no one is talking about this.
Right.
Nobody is. And this is probably why I'm not on CNN talking about this, because the consequences for the people who are currently in power and talking about the ramifications for culture and religion and sports, I don't think anybody dares to talk about what's actually happening now.
Right. Well, if you take attachment to concepts, any concept, sports, religion, birthday parties, whatever it is, weddings. If you take an attachment to that concept away and you just look at the sort of the foundational elements of it, and you apply it to the realities that we see today, as you say, from these super spreader events, where one person attending a wedding leaves hundreds at that wedding infected, which leaves several of many, if not more, dead. You have to. It doesn't matter what the event is. It doesn't matter if it's a congregation at a temple, church, or a mosque. It doesn't matter if it's a wedding or a football game or a basketball game. It's a place where you have to decide the relevance and the value of human life and make decisions.
And it's all trade-offs. And, it's easy to kind of come off as some sort of extreme dystopian on this. I mean, of course, I want to go back and live life as normal. And I've been affected by this like anybody else. I'm pointing out that in making those trade-offs, if you don't take the long-term view, you are making a trade-off that hurts you. We just take Norway, which is a case in point, right? Last week, they had, a major boat come with, infected with corona because they hadn't put foreign workers into quarantine.
Okay.
They weren't able to quarantine the passengers either, and they spread all around the country, and they're going to be one out of several clusters that are coming up now, hopefully contained, because the health system is, very apt at tracing and tracking. It's a small country. I think they will probably, manage to do this. But the point being, why on earth would they have opened up and, let one thing slip, and you could open the door to a scenario you just did not want.
Right.
So these are the choices we're making at a micro level. These are the choices we're making, hopefully, in this nation state scenario, where you're thinking about, where does my nation want to be in the next decade?
Right.
You, of course, want to be among the winners. I mean, winners meaning a good part of this population survives and your economy doesn't completely implode.
Yep.
But what we're doing right now, we're acting within bounded rationality that doesn't take a decade's perspective, and certainly not 3 decades perspective.
Yeah.
And I think that's natural, because politicians, unfortunately, are elected with much shorter timelines. And I think those are some of the tensions inside of that scenario of nation state renewal, because the best nations actually think about that, put in place governance systems where even the legislators are now incented over longer timelines. Like in parliaments, in some countries, you are there for 8 years. And I think maybe even in government and in the prime minister level, you have to start thinking, what is the value of having a new government every 3 to 6 months, in worst case, when they fail, in a scenario where the world is actually falling apart? Right. Is that really rational?
You point out, even in times of disaster, people don't mind a dictator. Sometimes that's helpful.
Well, and it doesn't have to be a dictator. It can be publicly elected, but it's elected within a different framework.
Yep. No, absolutely. So if we take a look at the implications on work and with a longer term, and it really is interesting, because just in our particular line of work, we were able to pivot a lot of people home. Tens of thousands of people who had been working in buildings in close proximity to their colleagues, because that's just what you do. And we're able to pivot them home. And it was really predicated on a technology foundation that 20 years ago would not have been there. And in some cases, depending on the region, the country, still wasn't necessarily there. And we needed to make accommodations for setting up internet at home, or getting people computers, even chairs and desks in some cases. But we were able to. In scenario 2, which I find really interesting, because you're playing this forward 10 years, you talk about an advancement in technology that includes AI. And in fact, it's cool. You say that it's been authorized that AI can now achieve full autonomy. You're now, the checks are off, and you trust the technology well enough to have full autonomy, which I imagine means it can do work that we've aspired to digitize. But you also talk about 8G wireless cellular communications, which sounds lovely. And because of that 8G, people can work pretty much anywhere. You say you can download all of Hollywood's movies in 5 minutes. So it's a massive pipe, and that's good. But then there are jobs that you still need to be physically present for. And that's the intermittency idea of people going to work for a few weeks, then staying home for a few weeks. That's publicly supported. And it's almost like a basic universal income / social support program. Just because.
Well, that's maybe where I reveal myself as a Scandinavian welfare state person, because what I'm seeing here is that at least the nation state framework sets up the possibility to do so. And it's actually rational, even for a US Republican person, to think in these terms in order to save a sustainable economy in the long term.
Right.
It's just that, when the debate is so polarized, you don't quite see it. But I would say the foundation of freedom right now is to have the right and possibility to work, whether you are,
absolutely,
male, female, whatever ethnicity, whatever immunocompromised state you're in. And in order to facilitate that, you're going to have to set up a framework that enables the kind of liberty that you're actually trying to protect in the first place.
Right. Like life, liberty, and livelihood, because
yeah, and then the pursuit of property, which was John Locke's original formulation, right? Life, liberty, and the pursuit of property. He sort of smartly saw that. I don't know if you saw that, but in one of my scenarios, I actually envisioned that if the vaccine fails completely, what we're going to have to do is just to divide the world into geographical plots of land and then put people as spread out as possible. And if you luck out in the lottery, sort of in a John Rawlsian way, theory of justice, he sort of said, imagine a new society where you don't know where you'll end up.
Yeah.
And I think, eventually we might even get there where we say, well, we're just going to have to spread out on this planet. We're going to have to be as far apart as we can within the limits. And we're going to have to set up a completely new infrastructure where cities aren't as valuable, in this new picture.
Impossible.
Because the point is to have the idealized as minimal as possible, because the distance is always going to be an advantage. Yeah. Proximity is always going to be an advantage. So, and I think that's, goes back to some of my PhD findings, which is no matter how advanced the technologies are, I think human beings, we are not yet a virtual species. No matter what, Elon Musk's Neuralink and Neurala and those other kind of cognitive technologies enable us to do, it'll be a few decades away. And by that, I mean at least 50 to 70 years before we'll even start contemplating some sort of equity between being apart and being physically present.
Interesting. And so, and there we are. So the future of work, as far as your PhD and what you studied, what you've seen, what you've scenario played out in your book, what's the future of work look like for the next, let's think short term, for the next 2 years? Are we going back to the office? Are we all just signing up for the fastest internet provider we can find? And will I ever wear long pants again or shoes? Or can I just do this in shorts and flip-flops from now on?
Yeah, and it depends on the risk profile of your employer and of yourself. Yeah. Because clearly, employers are going to have to find ways to allow some workers to come back. In some businesses, that's fundamental. Mm-hmm. I happen to be one of those people, in the IT industry, we worked virtually for the last 20 years. Yeah. The cost of that, however, is that the identity and the kind of loyalty you have to an employer decreases significantly. So as much as I loved working for, Oracle at the time, I was spending much more time with my colleague from IBM because we were aligned on the things that we try to accomplish with governments, and we were spending a lot more time together. And even when I was apart, I was, thousands of miles away from my line managers and things, which of course is just a point to say, well, we're a global corporation. But at the end of the day, when you make those kinds of choices, those are trade-offs and they're not ideal. And I think the answer to your question is put on some pants and get yourself to the office at least once a week, and if not, at the very minimum, once a month. And those who don't do that are going to suffer in creativity. They're going to not develop any new products really of significance. They are going to experience that their 1,000 workers are going to be outcompeted by a startup with 10 people in a garage, because those startups already were outcompeting them. And now all you have is scale and leverage. So essentially, there's more money going to the big conglomerates who are able to use their digital platforms, aka the Amazons, in all verticals of the world. They will get an enormous power. Everybody in the middle, whether you are a second-tier university, whether you are a second-tier corporation, whatever you are in the middle, will be squeezed out. And the only answer as an individual is you have to develop a unique position in the middle where you are a gatekeeper and a broker between different spheres of knowledge. Most of that can be done virtually. All of it cannot be done virtually. And if you try to do so, you will be outside the workplace. And you have to reinvent yourself with a startup or something like that, because you're going to be insignificant unless you tether yourself to something.
Yeah. Now, and all the different levels of humanity as a construct in humans as animals, as far as there is the social element, which, distance is hard to deal with, and it's not something we'll evolve out of, right? We evolved to where we are today because we survived various different physical challenges, but the personal one, it'll be interesting to see if even 50 or 70 years evolved us. But
so just one thing, in 2000, when I wrote this PhD on what the net can't do, there was this vision, and Cisco was the biggest kind of protagonist in this vision. They put it into their mission statement, changing the way the world lives, works, plays, and, all of those things. But the point is, at the center was this vision of the nomadic worker, as if a nomad voluntarily moves around. It was a complete misunderstanding, because even the nomad, the only reason nomads move around is because they exhaust the resources of the burnt earth that they have been living on, so they are forced to move around. So it was a complete misunderstanding of the history of nomadism,
Right. Yeah, or they're being chased by a saber-toothed tiger, and so they need to get away from danger or to resource. No, absolutely. Exactly. Yeah, that's an interesting take on the sort of the digital nomad concept, which people are excited by, that they can work from anywhere. But
I'm excited by it too. I mean, and you can exploit it. But the point is, and I think this ties into something we were just talking about right before OneTAKE kicked off. Video conferencing, digital technology, all of the things that, of course, have done wonders. And I'm sure with Sykes, you have been able to do things that just weren't possible 20, 30 years ago. Yet, there are so many things where the prime time nature of these technologies just wasn't there. Right? We've been Facebooking for a decade or two, but, video conferencing didn't move forward, for that reason. Right. And we are still trying to reproduce a poor version of social cues that we perhaps didn't even like face to face. So now this is the decade where we'll have to innovate on the very nature of communication, improving based on the fact that how would it look like if we weren't trying to reproduce the meeting? I mean, what is a meeting anyway? I don't even like meetings, right? And what is a meeting? And why would you reproduce that by sitting tethered to 25 people around a screen? This makes no sense. And in terms of learning, it's even worse. Right. This is not what we should be doing.
Right. Absolutely. So this is we're nearing the end of the hour. I'd be remiss if we didn't wrap up with your future, your scenario. What are you working on next? Because I think you're working on another book that I think is quite relevant to what we just discussed too. So
I really hope so.
Okay. Yeah. So leave us with that. Leave us with what are you working on? What's next for you, and any other final takeaways for our listeners?
Fundamentally, I'm working on the next big thing. Meaning, I've always taken on big challenges. I'm kind of looking for the next one that is small enough that I actually can make a difference, and big enough that it can inspire me. In doing so, I guess I'm the last 3 weeks in writing my next book, which will be out in March. It's called Future Tech. It'll chart kind of what I see as the advice to somebody who wants to get ahead and make an impact in the next decade, using technologies and being as much of a polymath as you can in as many technologies as possible, but making very sound choices in terms of where you go wide and where you go deep. That's what I can say about that book. And then I just started a podcast called Futurized, where I think the ambition really is not just to have conversations about the next decade, but to really get inspired by people who crave knowledge and want to create things, but they have a soul behind what they're doing. They have an idea. They desire to do something for the world. And that's really what I'm passionate about. And again, I'm using the same framework that I wrote the book on, which is this forces of disruption framework, where technology and founders are going to come on this show, and we've had a bunch of those so far. But social dynamics, regulatory changes, and the awareness of regulators. I've spent so much time trying to advise parliamentarians around the world on what the future looks like. That is not an insignificant challenge. Those guys are responsible for the world we're going into, and they were never equipped to do so. So I'm passionate about that, but where that leads to in terms of what organization might be interested in, in what I have to say, currently thinking about that. I think that I will continue innovating with Yegii, but I do need a big set of partners and people who are willing to buy into that vision. So I'm kind of open now on where the next kind of physical home for some of these, thoughts are.
Yeah.
But I definitely want to move into an organizational context where I can have an impact, because I think organizations is where you can amplify.
Yeah.
And I was just having an interview with an entrepreneur who said, early on, 100 hours a week is kind of reasonable as a founder, and you just have to spend those 100 hours in a wise way. I don't know how he got to 100. It's a pretty high number, but I sympathize. I typically work in 100-hour weeks when I have something important to do. But the point is this: if you, after 2 years, are still doing 100 hours and you have 1,000 employees, this is Magnus Grimmelon from Antler, wonderful VC company that has just mushroomed in the last year. Sure. The point is, you're doing something wrong then. If you have 1,000 employees and you're still working 100-hour days, right. 100-hour weeks, those employees should be doing some of that work. And I think that's my ambition for the next few years, is to get into, again, like I was at MIT, like I was at Oracle or in the EU, into an organizational context where my thoughts can inspire, but I don't have to do all those 100 hours, not because I'm not willing to do them, I'm a hard worker, but because they make no sense. Once you've set the framework,
gotcha,
you have to let other people innovate on top of it.
Outstanding. Well, Trond, thank you. Thank you for lending your incredible and unique and informed experience, your polymath, your prolific polymath abilities. And we will put the link to this book, Pandemic Aftermath. We'll put a link to your podcast, Futurize. We'll put a link to the other books you've written. This is an extraordinary read because it really does more than just sort of remind us of what we've just been going through the last few months, but lays out these really interesting scenarios, some of which are optimistic and really sort of engender enthusiasm, and some which are dark and suggest we should be careful we don't find ourselves there. So I truly appreciate you taking the time out of your sprint writing of your next book. Look forward to seeing what that is, and even having you back on the show to talk about that when you're able to.
Ian, you're so gracious, and I'm very uncomfortable with compliments, being a Scandinavian, but I will take one for the book, if only because I think it's important. And please read the book, and if you disagree with it, I love that too. That I don't care. Yeah. Please read the book. At least spend a few seconds. It doesn't cost you many dollars. I can send it to you if you can't afford it. I just want people to consider some of these things, because I really want my kids to grow up in a world that works.
I agree. Couldn't have said it better myself. Thank you, Trond. Thanks everybody for tuning in to this OneTAKE episode, and hope you're all well and safe. And I will speak to you again next show. Thanks everybody. Take care.